The first time I noticed something was off with Sarah, it was subtle. So subtle, in fact, that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. She had always been vibrant. Her laughter a melody I could pick out in any room. But over the past month, that laugh had started to feel like a track on repeat, perfectly timed yet somehow hollow. My name's Eric. I'm a software engineer, and I work from home most days, which means I have an up-close view of Sarah's comings and goings. We live in Raleigh, North Carolina, where life is as steady as the rolling hills until, well, it isn't. Sarah works as a marketing manager, her job keeping her in perpetual motion. She's always had the kind of drive that makes her irresistible to clients and, I suppose, other people too. Last Friday evening, we were supposed to have our usual date night. Something simple at Carter's Grill, where the steak melts in your mouth and the bourbon hits just right. But Sarah came home late, her hair tousled in a way that suggested wind, not work. "Sorry, Eric," she said breathlessly, tossing her purse on the counter. "Big client meeting ran over. Let's rain check tonight." I nodded, even though her explanation didn't sit right. She had that glow, the kind you see in people who've been out in the sun, or maybe the kind you see in people who are carrying a secret. I couldn't decide which, and maybe that was the first real crack in the foundation. It wasn't the first time she'd canceled plans, but something about her tone this time felt different. I wanted to ask her outright, but my throat tightened. Instead, I just said, "Sure," and watched as she drifted upstairs, her phone clutched tightly in her hand like a lifeline. That night, lying alone in bed, the ache in my chest began to grow. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I'd have to find it soon. The following Monday, Sarah left earlier than usual, claiming she needed to prepare for a client presentation. Normally, she'd linger over her coffee, scrolling through her phone or chatting with me about her day ahead. This time, she rushed out the door without so much as a goodbye kiss. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the swirling pattern in the grain of the wood, trying to make sense of the gnawing unease in my gut. It wasn't like her to be this distant. We'd always been a team, partners who could weather anything together, or so I thought. Around noon, I decided to take a break from coding and stepped outside for some air. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence that buzzes in your ears. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from Sarah's Instagram. It wasn't a post, just a story update, but curiosity got the better of me. It was a boomerang clip of 2 coffee cups on a small, rustic table. The caption read, "Fueling up before the grind." I recognized the cafe, a little place downtown we used to visit on weekends. It was the kind of spot where you went to linger, not grab a quick coffee to go. What caught my eye wasn't the setting but the second cup. The sleeve had a familiar logo scrawled on it, one from a nearby gym. I knew Sarah wasn't working out before meetings. She'd barely had time to breathe lately, or so she'd said. That small detail sparked something I couldn't shake. I spent the rest of the day alternating between convincing myself it was nothing and replaying every recent conversation we'd had. That evening, when Sarah came home, she was unusually chipper. She kissed my cheek, something she hadn't done in days, and started rambling about how productive her day had been. I watched her closely as she spoke, trying to decode the unspoken. Was there guilt in her voice? Relief? "Who were you meeting with downtown?" I asked casually, careful to keep my tone light. She froze for just a second, but it was long enough for me to catch it. "Oh, just a client," she said, her smile a little too practiced. "Why?" "No reason," I replied, though my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't press her further. Not yet. But a seed had been planted, and I could feel its roots starting to take hold. Something wasn't right, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't trust her. The following days felt like a chess game I wasn't prepared to play. Sarah continued her usual routine, or what seemed like her usual routine. Her movements were so measured, so deliberate, that it almost felt like she was performing. Wednesday night, as we sat on the couch watching a rerun of some sitcom, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then quickly tilted it away and placed it face down on the coffee table. My stomach clenched. Sarah had never been the type to guard her phone. In fact, she used to tease me about how boring her texts were. "Just work stuff and mom asking about recipes," she'd say. But now her phone might as well have been locked in Fort Knox. Who was that? I asked casually, keeping my eyes on the TV. Oh, just Amber from work, she said. Her voice light but not quite natural. She needed help with a project. I nodded, pretending to be absorbed in the laugh track, but my mind raced. Amber? Sarah hadn't mentioned her in months. The name felt plucked from thin air, and my gut told me it was a lie. Later that night, as Sarah showered, I finally caved to the nagging voice in my head. Her phone was still on the coffee table, face down like a shield. My heart pounded as I reached for it. It was locked, of course, but I knew the passcode, her college graduation year. My hands shook as I entered it, and the screen unlocked with a soft click. What I found was nothing. No texts, no calls, no recent messages from anyone named Amber. Just a suspiciously clean slate, as though her phone had been scrubbed of anything that might raise questions. I was about to put it back when a notification lit up the screen. A message from an unknown number. Can't wait to see you Friday. Same place? I stared at the words, my blood turning cold. Who was this? What place? My hands hovered over the phone, debating whether to open the message or confront her directly. The sound of the shower shutting off jolted me back to reality. I locked the phone and placed it exactly where I'd found it, then retreated to the kitchen, pretending to grab a glass of water. When Sarah came down, she was humming to herself, her hair damp and cascading over her shoulders. She looked radiant, carefree, like the woman I'd fallen in love with. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was staring at a stranger. Want some tea? She asked, her voice sweet and warm. I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, that'd be nice. As she moved around the kitchen, I felt the weight of that message pressing down on me. I needed answers, but I had to be smart about it. The unknown number, the suspicious behavior, they were breadcrumbs leading somewhere, and I was determined to follow the trail. Friday couldn't come soon enough. Friday arrived with a heavy sense of foreboding. I pretended to immerse myself in work, but my mind was elsewhere. Every tick of the clock felt like a countdown to some inevitable, life-altering revelation. Sarah was unusually quiet that morning. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out, her perfume lingering in the air as the door clicked shut. She said she had a team lunch downtown and might be home late. My stomach churned at the thought. As soon as she left, I pulled up the phone tracking app I'd quietly installed the day before. It wasn't something I ever imagined I'd do, but desperation makes you cross lines you'd once considered unthinkable. The little blinking dot, representing Sarah's phone, was moving steadily toward the city center. By lunchtime, the dot stopped at a location I recognized. The Riverwalk Cafe, a quaint, tucked-away spot we discovered together years ago. We used to love sitting by the water, sipping coffee and planning vacations we never quite got around to taking. My chest tightened. Why would she go there? I grabbed my keys and jacket, heart pounding as I drove toward the cafe. My mind raced with possibilities, each more devastating than the last. By the time I arrived, I was trembling, unsure whether I even wanted to know the truth. I parked a block away and walked toward the cafe, keeping my head low. Peering through the large bay windows, I scanned the tables until I spotted her. Sarah was seated at a corner table, her back to me. Across from her was a man I didn't recognize. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, with the confident posture of someone who didn't have to worry about being caught. They were laughing, leaning in close as though sharing a secret. Her hand rested lightly on his forearm, a gesture that made my stomach drop. I ducked back, retreating to the sidewalk before my presence could be noticed. My head spun as I tried to piece together what I'd just seen. Was it innocent? A work meeting? But why here at our place? I couldn't just walk away, not without knowing more. Circling around to the side of the building, I found a small outdoor patio shielded by a low hedge. From there, I had a clear view of their table without being seen. Their conversation seemed animated, punctuated by smiles and the occasional touch. At one point, the man reached into his pocket and slid something across the table. A small, wrapped box. Sarah's face lit up as she accepted it, her cheeks flushing pink. I felt a sickening lurch in my gut. Whatever shred of doubt I'd been clinging to evaporated in that moment. This wasn't work. This wasn't innocent. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, frozen between anger and heartbreak. When Sarah finally stood to leave, I ducked out of sight, watching as they walked out together. The man opened the door for her, and she smiled up at him in a way that used to be reserved for me. They went their separate ways, and I followed Sarah's car at a safe distance. Back home, she walked through the door with an air of nonchalance, greeting me with a casual, "Hey, how was your day?" I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead I played my part, nodding and saying, "Busy." As Sarah disappeared upstairs, the weight of what I'd seen crushed me. There was no denying it anymore. Something was happening, and it was tearing us apart. The question now was, what would I do about it? The weekend passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Sarah was cheerful, perhaps too much so, and I couldn't tell if it was genuine or a performance. Every time she laughed, I found myself wondering if she was thinking about him. Saturday morning, she suggested we go for a hike, something we hadn't done in months. "We've both been so busy," she said, tying her hair into a ponytail. "Let's just get out and enjoy the day." I agreed, though the idea of spending time together felt like walking a tightrope. On the trail, Sarah was all smiles, pointing out birds and joking about how out of shape we'd become. I tried to match her energy, but my mind kept drifting back to the cafe, to the box she had eagerly accepted from that stranger. What was in it? Jewelry? A key? A letter? I hated myself for obsessing, but I couldn't stop. "Eric, are you okay?" Sarah asked, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Yeah, just tired." I lied, forcing a smile. "Didn't sleep well last night." She frowned, her expression tinged with concern. For a brief moment, I wondered if she really did care, if maybe I was imagining all of this. But then I remembered her glowing face at the cafe, the way she'd leaned into his every word. By the time we got home, I was emotionally drained. Sarah suggested ordering takeout and watching a movie, but I feigned a headache and retreated to the bedroom. She didn't push, which only made me feel worse. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I resolved to dig deeper. I needed clarity, answers that would either confirm my worst fears or prove me wrong. On Sunday afternoon, while Sarah was out grocery shopping, I searched the house for the box she had been given. I felt ridiculous, like some paranoid fool, but the compulsion was too strong to ignore. I started with her closet, carefully sifting through the shelves and drawers. Nothing. Moving to her nightstand, I opened the small drawer and immediately froze. There, tucked beneath a paperback novel, was the box. It was a simple, elegant design, black with a gold ribbon. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a small charm, a heart. My throat tightened as I stared at it, the implications hitting me like a freight train. This wasn't the kind of gift a colleague would give. It was intimate, personal. Before I could think, I heard the sound of the front door opening. Panic surged through me. I quickly replaced the box, arranging everything as it was, and shut the drawer. "Eric," Sarah called from downstairs. "Up here." I yelled back, trying to keep my voice steady. She appeared in the doorway moments later, carrying a paper bag. "I got your favorite Thai curry," she said with a smile. I managed a weak smile in return. "Thanks, babe." As she turned and headed toward the kitchen, I sat there, reeling. The cracks in our marriage weren't just visible now. They were gaping, and I had no idea how to bridge them. Whatever was happening between Sarah and this mystery man, it was more than just a flirtation. And now it was up to me to decide what to do next. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. The bracelet sat in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't dislodge, its presence a constant reminder of the widening chasm between Sarah and me. She left for work, oblivious, or perhaps unconcerned, about the storm brewing inside me. I watched from the window as her car disappeared down the street, then sank into the couch with a heavy sigh. I'd spent all night replaying our interactions over the last few weeks, trying to pinpoint the moment when things began to shift. Was it a slow erosion, like sand slipping through fingers? Or had it happened all at once like a flash of lightning? By mid-morning, I couldn't sit still anymore. I grabbed my laptop and began to dig. The tracking app still showed Sarah at her office, but I wasn't interested in her current location. I needed to know more about the man from the cafe. I started with a search for local gyms, hoping the logo on the coffee cup might lead me somewhere. It didn't take long to find a match. Summit Fitness, a high-end facility known for its elite clientele. Next, I searched through social media, scanning the gym's tagged posts and member check-ins. After what felt like hours, I found him a profile picture that matched the man I'd seen with Sarah. His name was Ryan Keller, and according to his bio, he was a personal trainer and part-time model. Model, of course. The guy looked like he'd stepped out of a cologne ad. My jaw clenched as I scrolled through his photos, each one more infuriating than the last. There were no direct connections to Sarah, no tagged photos, no comments, but the timing of everything was too coincidental to ignore. I stared at his smiling face, my mind racing with questions. How had they met? Was this just some fleeting affair? Or had it been going on for months? And most importantly, did she love him? I slammed the laptop shut, frustration bubbling over. This was getting me nowhere. If I wanted answers, I'd have to confront Sarah directly. But not yet. Not without more proof. That evening, I tried to act normal when Sarah came home. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and started cooking dinner as if everything were fine. I watched her move around the kitchen, the ease and familiarity of her gestures clashing with the growing distance between us. For a moment, I considered blurting everything out, demanding she explain the bracelet, the cafe, Ryan. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I leaned against the counter and forced a smile. Busy day. Exhausting, she replied, pouring herself a glass of wine. How about you? Same, I said, though the truth was far more complicated. We ate dinner in near silence, the conversation stilted and hollow. Every time she glanced at me, I felt like she could see the doubt written across my face. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. The divide between us was growing, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had to give, and soon. The question was, would it be the truth or our marriage? Tuesday morning dawned gray and heavy, mirroring the turmoil inside me. Sarah was out the door early again, citing back-to-back meetings as she rushed through her coffee. As soon as her car disappeared from view, I grabbed my phone and called the private investigator I'd been debating hiring for days. I'd seen his ad online. Some guy named Dan Archer, who promised discreet solutions for complicated problems. Archer Investigations, came the gruff voice on the other end. Hi, this is Eric Brooks. I began, my throat dry. I need help confirming something about my wife. There was a pause, followed by a faint sigh. You're looking for evidence of infidelity? Yes, I admitted, the word tasting bitter. Okay, we can meet today. My office is downtown, corner of 5th and Main. How's 2 p.m.? That works. The line went dead, leaving me to sit in the suffocating quiet of the house. I stared at the clock, each minute dragging as I waited for the meeting. By the time 2 p.m. rolled around, I was more anxious than I'd ever been. Dan's office was in a nondescript building, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Inside, the decor was sparse. Beige walls, a simple desk, and a few filing cabinets. Dan himself was a no-nonsense type, dressed in a wrinkled button-down and slacks. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and his sharp eyes seemed to see right through me. Have a seat, he said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. I sat, trying not to fidget as I explained everything. Sarah's late nights, the cafe, the bracelet, and the man I'd identified as Ryan Keller. Dan listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying nothing. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. All right, he said finally. I can look into this Ryan Keller guy, see if there's more to your wife's connection with him. Do you want surveillance? Yes, I said without hesitation. I need to know the truth. Dan scribbled some notes on a yellow legal pad. Okay, I'll start today. I'll need her work schedule, any regular habits, and the license plate of her car. We'll go from there. I handed over the information, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. This was it, the point of no return. Give me a few days, Dan said as I stood to leave. I'll have something for you soon. The ride home was agonizing. Every mile felt heavier, my thoughts bouncing between hope and despair. What if I was wrong? What if I was right? When I walked through the door, Sarah was already home, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop. She looked up and smiled, her eyes soft and warm in a way that twisted the knife in my chest. Hey, you're home early, she said. Yeah, I replied, forcing a smile. Slow day at work. She nodded, returning to her screen. I stood there for a moment, watching her, wondering how someone could look so normal while my world was falling apart. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. We ate dinner, watched a bit of TV, and went to bed without much conversation. But as I lay there beside her, the weight of my decision pressed down on me. Dan was out there, digging into Sarah's life. Soon I'd have answers. I just wasn't sure I was ready for them. The following days passed in excruciating limbo. Dan kept in touch with brief updates, though his tone was always careful, guarded. Thursday evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through old photos on my phone, Dan called. My heart leapt at the sight of his name on the screen, though the dread that followed was almost paralyzing. Eric, he said, his voice steady. I've got something. Can you meet tomorrow morning? Yes, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. What time? 9 a.m. at my office. Okay, I'll be there. The line went dead, leaving me with a heavy knot in my stomach. I glanced at Sarah, who was curled up on the other side of the couch, reading a book. She looked so peaceful, so oblivious to the storm brewing around us. I considered saying something, testing the waters with a harmless question, but I stopped myself. Tomorrow I'd have real answers or, at the very least, a direction. That night I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what Dan had uncovered. The bracelet, the cafe, Ryan Keller. It all swirled in my mind, a toxic cocktail of doubt and suspicion. By the time morning arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. Sarah left early, as usual, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek before heading out. Have a good day, she said, her voice light and carefree. You too, I replied, forcing a smile. The drive to Dan's office felt surreal, like I was watching myself from a distance. When I arrived, he was waiting for me, a folder sitting ominously on his desk. Morning, he said, gesturing for me to sit. I lowered myself into the chair, my hands trembling slightly. What did you find? Dan opened the folder and slid a few photos across the desk. My heart sank as I stared at them. The first showed Sarah and Ryan at the Riverwalk Cafe, their heads bent close together in conversation. The second captured them walking along the waterfront, her arm looped casually through his. The third was the worst. It showed them standing by her car, locked in an embrace. His hand rested on her back, and her face was buried in his chest. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The room spun, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. There's more, Dan said, his voice low. He slid a small USB drive across the desk. Surveillance footage from yesterday. I haven't watched all of it, but what I've seen, well, you'll want to take a look. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Where was this taken? At a hotel, Dan said bluntly. Downtown. They were there for a couple of hours. The words hit me like a hammer, each one driving a nail deeper into the coffin of my marriage. I took the USB with shaking hands, unsure whether I even wanted to see what it contained. Eric, Dan said, his tone softening. I know this is hard, but at least now you know. You can make a decision based on the truth. I nodded, unable to speak. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts a whirlwind of anger, pain, and betrayal. When I got back, I locked myself in the office and plugged the USB into my computer. As the video began to play, my worst fears were confirmed. There they were, Sarah and Ryan, laughing and touching in ways that left no room for doubt. The footage was grainy, but the intimacy between them was unmistakable. I stopped the video halfway through, unable to stomach anymore. Sitting back in my chair, I stared at the screen, my mind racing. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was real. Now I had to figure out what came next. For hours, I sat in the dark office, the glow of the computer screen casting long shadows across the room. The images and footage played on an endless loop in my mind, each frame carving deeper into my resolve. Sarah was cheating. There was no denying it now. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the burn doing little to dull the ache in my chest. Every part of me wanted to storm out, to confront her wherever she was, to demand answers she probably wouldn't give. But the rational part of me held back. I needed to approach this carefully, not for her sake but for mine. The rest of the day dragged by in a haze. Sarah returned home in the late afternoon, carrying a paper bag of groceries and humming to herself. She looked so normal, so untouched by the storm she'd unleashed. "Hey," she said cheerfully, setting the bag on the counter. "How was your day?" "Fine," I replied, my voice strained. I couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. If she noticed, she didn't comment. She started putting away the groceries, chatting about some new recipe she wanted to try. I nodded along, barely hearing her words. Dinner that night was a silent affair. Sarah seemed content with the quiet, scrolling through her phone as she ate. I picked at my food, my appetite long gone. Afterward, she suggested watching a movie, but I declined, claiming a headache. She looked concerned for a moment, then shrugged it off and retreated to the living room. I went back to the office, locking the door behind me. The USB still sat on the desk, a silent witness to the wreckage of my marriage. I didn't watch the footage again. I didn't need to. The truth was already etched into my mind, and no amount of replaying it would change what I'd seen. Instead, I spent the night drafting a letter. Not to Sarah, but to myself, a way to sort through the chaos in my head. I wrote about the love we'd shared, the life we'd built, and the betrayal that had torn it apart. By the time I finished, the sun was rising, its pale light creeping through the blinds. I felt hollow, like the words on the page had drained me of everything. When Sarah woke, she found me in the kitchen, staring blankly into a cup of coffee. "You're up early," she said, stifling a yawn. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and grabbed a banana from the counter. "I've got a meeting at 9, but I'll be home early. Maybe we can do something tonight." "Maybe," I said, my voice flat. As she left, I realized I couldn't keep this to myself much longer. The truth was a weight I couldn't carry alone. I just didn't know if I was ready for the fallout. Friday evening arrived with a suffocating tension that I could no longer ignore. Sarah had come home early, just as she promised, and she seemed to be in a particularly good mood. Her smile was bright, her voice light as she talked about her day. Meanwhile, I could barely hold myself together. The folder from Dan sat in my office, the evidence it contained burning a hole in my resolve. Every moment I waited felt like another crack forming in the dam of my composure. After dinner, as Sarah loaded the dishwasher, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. "Sarah," I said, my voice firmer than I expected, "we need to talk." She glanced over her shoulder, a faint frown creasing her brow. "About what? Can you sit down, please?" I gestured to the table, my heart hammering in my chest. The confusion on her face deepened, but she complied, taking a seat across from me. "What's going on, Eric? You're scaring me." I sat down, my hands resting flat on the table to keep them from shaking. For a moment, I struggled to find the words, but then the weight of everything came rushing out. "I know, Sarah," I said, my voice low, "about Ryan, about the cafe, about the hotel." Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. What are you talking about? Don't lie to me," I snapped, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. "I've seen the pictures, Sarah. I've seen the footage. I know everything." For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes wide and glassy. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, Her expression hardened. "You've been spying on me?" she accused, her voice sharp. "Following me? Are you serious, Eric? You don't get to turn this around on me." I shot back, my anger boiling over. "You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, betraying me. And now you're trying to make me the villain." Her jaw clenched, and she crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "I wasn't sneaking around," she said defensively. "Ryan is just a friend." "Don't," I said, shaking my head. "Don't insult my intelligence. Friends don't meet at hotels, Sarah. Friends don't give each other bracelets." Her silence was deafening. "How long?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How long has this been going on?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or anger. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded. She hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. It didn't mean anything," she finally said. "I was just, I don't know, Eric. I was lonely. You've been so distant lately, and I made a mistake." "A mistake," I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Sarah, you didn't just trip and fall into this guy's arms. You made a choice, over and over again." Her tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Eric. I didn't mean to hurt you." Her words rang hollow, an echo of apologies I hadn't yet heard but somehow always expected. For a long moment, I just stared at her, the woman I had loved and trusted, now a stranger sitting across from me. "I need time," I said finally, my voice cold. "Time to figure out what this means for us. For me." She looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Eric, please." But I stood and walked away, her voice fading behind me. For the first time in years, I slept in the guest room, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a stone. There was no going back now, only forward, whatever that looked like. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of the guest room, but it brought no warmth, no comfort. I woke with a pounding headache, the weight of the confrontation still heavy in my chest. I could hear Sarah moving around downstairs, her footsteps muted but frantic, like she was pacing. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what came next. Divorce? Counseling? I didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. Eventually, I forced myself to get up. When I entered the kitchen, Sarah was at the table, nursing a cup of coffee. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked up at me with a mixture of hope and fear. "Morning," she said softly, her voice tentative. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a mug and pouring myself a cup. An awkward silence stretched between us, the air thick with everything we hadn't said. "Eric, don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Not yet. I can't do this right now." She nodded, her gaze dropping to her cup. "Okay." I left the room and retreated to my office, closing the door behind me. I sat at my desk, staring at the folder Dan had given me. The photos, the videos, they were proof of her betrayal, but they were also a prison. Every time I looked at them, I felt the anger, the heartbreak all over again. I needed clarity. I needed help. Without thinking, I picked up my phone and called my older brother, Mark. He was the one person I trusted to give me the unfiltered truth, no matter how hard it was to hear. "Eric?" he answered, his voice groggy. "Hey, Mark. You got a minute?" "For you? Always. What's up?" I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "Sarah's been cheating on me." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice low and steady. "Jesus, Eric. Are you sure?" "Yeah. I hired a PI. I've got pictures, videos, everything." "Damn," he said, exhaling sharply. "What are you gonna do?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know what to do, Mark. I feel like my whole world is falling apart." "Look, man," he said, his tone firm. "You don't have to make any decisions right now. Take some time, figure out what you really want. If you need to get out of there for a few days, you can crash at my place. Thanks, I said, feeling a small wave of relief. I might take you up on that. We talked for a while longer, and by the time I hung up, I felt a little steadier. Mark was right. I didn't have to decide everything today. When I finally left my office, Sarah was still at the table, her untouched coffee now cold. She looked up as I entered, her expression filled with uncertainty. I'm going to Mark's for a few days, I said, grabbing my keys from the counter. I need some space. Her face crumpled, tears welling up again. Eric, please don't go. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. I need time, Sarah, I said, my voice firm. I can't think straight here. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk. She didn't argue, just nodded as the tears spilled down her cheeks. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The next steps would be painful, but they were mine to take, and for now that was enough. The drive to Mark's place was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional car passing by. The weight of leaving Sarah behind didn't feel as heavy as I thought it would. Instead, it felt like a necessary step. Mark greeted me at the door with a firm handshake and a knowing look. He didn't press me for details, for which I was grateful. Instead, he offered me a beer, and we sat on his back porch, the evening air crisp and cool. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Eric, he said after a long silence. But you do need to ask yourself what you can live with, and what you can't. I nodded, taking a long sip of my beer. Mark's words were simple, but they struck a chord. Could I forgive Sarah? Could I rebuild trust after everything? That night, I lay awake in the spare room, my thoughts a whirlwind of questions and possibilities. Images of Sarah and Ryan played in my mind, but so did memories of the life Sarah and I had built together. The laughter, the quiet moments, the dreams we once shared. Morning came too quickly, and with it a new determination. I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. I needed clarity not just for myself, but for Sarah too. I spent the next few days talking to Mark, reflecting on the past, and imagining the future. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. When I finally called Sarah, her voice was a mixture of hope and trepidation. Eric? Yeah, I think we need to talk, I said, face to face. She agreed, and we decided to meet at a neutral place, a quiet park not far from our home. The walk there felt like an eternity, every step weighed down by the uncertainty of what I'd say. When I arrived, Sarah was already sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as I approached, her eyes filled with regret. Thank you for meeting me, she said softly. I nodded, sitting down beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us. I've had a lot of time to think. I began, my voice steady. And I've realized that this isn't just about what you did, Sarah. It's about what we've both let happen to us. She looked at me, her eyes widening in surprise. Eric, Let me finish, I interrupted gently. What you did hurt me, deeply. But I also see now that we've been drifting apart for a while. And I didn't do enough to stop it. Tears streamed down her face as she listened, her hands trembling. I never wanted to lose you, she whispered. I made a terrible mistake, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I can't promise what the future looks like for us, Sarah, but I think I'm willing to try. If you are. Her breath hitched, and she nodded fervently. I'll do anything, Eric. Anything to make this right. We talked for hours, laying everything bare. The pain, the doubts, the love that still lingered despite everything. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. That evening, as I walked back to Mark's place, I felt lighter. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like a path worth taking. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah and I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't perfect, and some days felt harder than others, but we kept moving forward, one step at a time. In the end, it wasn't about forgetting the betrayal or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about choosing to believe in the possibility of healing and, perhaps, a new beginning. If you like our content, leave a like and subscribe for more videos.